District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, better known as CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thanks for listening to the program.
This episode is brought to you by United Airlines. When you want to make the most of your vacation, book with United. They're an airline that cares about your travels as much as you do. United is transforming the flying experience with Bluetooth connectivity, screens, power at every seat, and bigger overhead bins to help fit everyone's bag. And with their app, you can skip the bag check line, get live updates, and more. Change the way you fly. Book your next trip today at united.com.
Want to shop Walmart Black Friday deals first? Walmart Plus members get early access to our hottest deals. Join now and get 50% off a one-year annual membership. Shop Black Friday deals first with Walmart Plus. See terms at walmartplus.com.
Welcome to District of Conservation. I'm your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. It's a rare twofer episode this week at District of Conservation. I want to bring your attention to a story that is troubling from across the Atlantic in a country I just visited, Denmark, and what our future could have been had we continued on the path of Biden-Harris. Denmark becomes the first nation, to my knowledge, to institute a so-called animal flatulence tax. This is being done and heralded as a combative measure to fight the so-called climate crisis, fight climate change, reduce methane emissions. And I'm going to explain why that is not the case. I've analyzed this policy. It is rooted in weaning people off of meat consumption. Of course, we are omnivorous as a population, even those in Denmark. And this is just a ploy to get people off of this under the guise of fighting climate change. But it's not going to be good for the environment. It's actually going to be very bad for the cows in question. It's going to be a lose-lose situation, but I want to take some time today to analyze the implications of this policy. Even though we won't see this federally advanced, we may see some states, blue states in particular, toy with this ridiculous policy. At the end of 2023, from what I was analyzing for work at IWF, for our Center for Energy and Conservation, they were toying with this policy for addressing the so-called problem of methane emissions from cow flatulence or cow farts. This will also apply to animal farts in general, livestock farts or flatulence. Back in June, I did a deep dive into what this policy entails, what the origins of it are. There's a particular plan that Denmark crafted where this strategy and playbook emanates from. It's also part of the EU or European Union Green New Deal. They have one instituted there, which is basically to rid of fossil fuels and all derivatives of fossil fuels, including fertilizer and the like, I believe by 2050, 2045, some arbitrary deadline. Our country was going to be going in this same direction. We're going to see come January these directives, this tackling the climate crisis executive order from January 2021, get nixed. And no more climate objectives by arbitrary deadlines to be followed because these frameworks don't make sense. They're costly. They don't do anything for the environment, and they leave people and nature worse off. So we're not seeing this here. But why this is problematic in Denmark, I'm going to explain why. What exactly is going to be taxed in terms of animal flatulence? This is from the BBC. I had reported on this for IWF and other places. But essentially, you're going to see from 2030, Danish farmers are going to essentially have to pay 43, or I've seen 34 per ton of methane emitted by livestock. This will then increase to 108 per ton of methane emitted by 2035. This is from the official reports that are coming out there. This was actually dated November 19th, so they actually are seriously following through with enacting this. But the BBC says Danish farmers will have to pay a tax for their animals' farts. This is because cows, sheep, and pig burps and farts produce a greenhouse gas called methane, which contributes to global warming and climate change. The flatulence tax means farmers will have to pay 300 kroner, or 34 euros per ton of methane that their animals produce in a bid to drive down Denmark's emissions. This has been decided for months of debate between the country's major political parties, Danish farmers, trade unions, and environmental groups. It's called the Green Tripartite Agreement. And it continues on, around 60% of Denmark's territory is currently cultivated, which means it is farmed. Therefore, the farming industry is responsible for a large proportion of Denmark's pollution. According to a 2023 report, the Danish agricultural industry has not reduced its greenhouse gas emissions for more than 10 years. But the new Green Tripartite Agreement aims to reduce the whole nation's CO2 emissions by up to 2.35 million tons by 2032. The minister leading the project, Jeppe Bruus, said that they will do what it takes to reach our climate goals. The plan includes trying to improve the biodiversity of the country by replacing farmland with over 250,000 hectares of new forest, according to the Danish news outlet the Copenhagen Post. They hope this will in turn improve the waterways around the country and improve drinking water. I'm taking a little bit from this Substack post that I have that comprehensively goes over this and the problems with this, debunking the assertion of methane reductions and changing the chemical makeup of cow flatulence, which I'll get into shortly. But again, this stems from the European Union and their kind of plans to wean people off of meat. This is not conspiratorial. There's actual documentation backing up this claim I am making. I first heard of this story from Bloomberg News back in June, and this is where I found this Danish plan to reduce meat consumption in Copenhagen and beyond. From this article, I was able to dig deeper as to where this particular Danish plan to wean their people off of meat came from, and I stumbled upon this Danish action plan for plant-based foods. Instead of reading the entire document for you, I'm going to take some of the kernels, the juicy kernels, I wrote about in this piece for Independent Women's Forum. This is a 40-page plan to forcibly make the Danish people, adopt a so-called plant-based diet. And I'm going to read some excerpts from this 40-page plan for you. They want to, in this plan, as I wrote, strengthen the Danish plant-based food sector by instituting a number of initiatives that support the value chain. And as I write in my piece, the ultimate goal here is to wean Danes off of meat consumption. This is my analysis, with the plan adding, quote, plant-based foods are the future. If we want to reduce the climate footprint within the agricultural sector, then we have to eat more plant-based foods. That's the conclusion. Now, this whole idea, wrapping our heads around, can you actually reduce methane emissions produced by cow farts, animal farts, through a practice called selective breeding? Will taxing animal flatulence actually reduce emissions? Anytime there's been a carbon tax, it actually has had the negative intended consequence. It actually does not lead to fewer emissions. It creates more burdens for people and less incentives for people to want to care about the environment. So I argue in my Substack overview of this, selective breeding is not going to help. So bear with me as I read through this section for you, but this simplifies and condenses why changing the chemical makeup of cow farts will not succeed and lead to methane emissions reductions. So I ask the question, can cows and pigs be selectively bred to reduce methane emissions? It's possible, but not without significant trade-offs, farmers and ranchers argue. Brett Moline, Director of Public and Governmental Affairs for the Wyoming Farm Bureau Federation, told Cowboy State Daily that cows bred for zero emissions could result in lower quality meat. Quote, you could get a cow with zero emissions, Moline said, but if the meat product is worthless, what good is it doing? You can't sacrifice low emissions for good quality meat, end quote. I added that selective breeding can be a zero-sum game. Moline cautioned that, as has happened in the past, favoring the lineage of one trait of cow will likely be to the detriment of others. He is quoted as saying, the ultimate goal of selective breeding in cattle is the highest quality meat, end quote. If cattle are selectively bred for lower methane outputs, that could sacrifice the quality of meat. This is not just American farmers. I'm also going to add some warnings and cautionary tales from Australia. The government of Western Australia also warned that selective breeding for methane could incur other risks. This is from the government website of Western Australia. It conceded tracking methane emissions is difficult and warned smaller cattle operations will see lower income benefits. The agency also argued that, quote, increased feed conversion efficiency, end quote, results in increased stocking rate, which would ironically increase total methane emissions. While this is not going to be federally adopted under the incoming Trump-Vance administration, we need to see what our friends in Europe are experimenting with to the detriment of their own populace, I would argue here. I don't think such a policy like this would fly in Poland or Lithuania. No way. It's a meat-eating society in both of those countries. I know for a fact in Lithuania, this would never fly. Western Europe, they're into this frou-frou weird food trends. And I'm not saying that governments should create laws mandating meat consumption either, but there's no directives forcing people to eat meat. You can choose to eat what you want. But the environmentalists in Europe, and even some here, want to mandate, even incrementally, weaning off of meat consumption, even though it is not good for your health. An omnivorous diet is recommended by most dietitians, exercise, what have you, to make up for the nutrients you will miss. From what I understand, you have to take supplements to mimic a lot of the vitamins that are naturally found in meat or animal protein. You're not going to be as healthy. You may struggle with different autoimmune conditions from a lack of meat in your diet. It's not necessarily good for you. I was even reading that rapper Lizzo was on a vegetarian diet, got off of it. I think she's now pescatarian, and she's lost a lot of weight in her weight loss journey from switching from a so-called healthy vegan diet or vegetarian diet to that of a smart application of meat or protein or animal protein of that nature. I think even musician Miley Cyrus weaned herself off of a vegan diet. She went to a pescatarian or somewhat animal protein diet and is in much better health as a result of it. So a lot of former vegans, vegetarians go back to eating animal protein because it's not healthy. Some people, I think there is someone I know in politics who has allergic reactions to meat, and she can only be on a vegan diet, but she's not pernicious about it. It's actually a pretty prominent conservative thought leader, believe it or not. But she's not one to be like, I'm going to mandate you eat a vegan diet. It's just her body does not accept, it actually sadly rejects meat and dairy, which would be so unfortunate to have an allergic reaction or some sort of autoimmune deficiency where you can't eat either. I would hate to have had that. But where we could see this type of policy experimented with, we're actually seeing a little bit of this in California right now. California has sanctioned cow farts in a similar manner. They're looking to experiment with cow flatulence as well. But as I noted in my Substack piece, this kind of update to this policy, there is a derivative policy or a related policy about climate credits for cow poop, and they don't seem to be amenable to the policy anymore. But we will see blue states in particular look to experiment with this. They should look to see how this is playing out in Denmark. I don't think this succeeds or lasts very long. I think you're going to see major pushback from agricultural interests, individual farmers, whether they're dairy or livestock farmers. Earlier this year, a lot of European farmers took to Brussels and their respective state capitals, sometimes by violent means. I'm not condoning the violent means, but they even resorted to violent means to protest fertilizer bans. What is to say that they will not protest maybe a little more peaceably these policies in Copenhagen or Brussels? You see what's playing out in Great Britain about a inheritance tax being imposed on family farms and another tax where there are a subsidization rather of $500 million to help farmers in developing countries from the Brits, from the United Kingdom, to be applied to farmers abroad. So British farmers are unacceptable. They're despoiling the environment, but the British government, under their Labour Party government, wants to subsidize farmers from developing countries. Makes absolutely no sense. So we should look to Europe to see what our future could be if we're not careful. Again, federally, this will be staved off for at least 4 years. But you may see this play out in blue states. But it's a cautionary tale. I would think Europe, after these protests, voters responding and voting in and voting out, rather, politicians who don't ascribe to the interests of farmers and ranchers. And again, this goes back to how deeply flawed and problematic net zero directives are. I cannot stress enough, not only is it bad on the energy production side and the ESG investing side, it also trickles down to animal agriculture. ESG has long attacked agriculture producers. I can give you a whole crash course. Go listen to past episodes to really kind of get up to speed about ESG. But this environmental, social, and governance investing posturing, whether it's through private investments or through government posturing and implementing some semblance of ESG governance or ESG posturing into policy through net zero and fighting the so-called climate crisis, this is what you get. This is this phasing out of meat or this discouraging of meat consumption as a result. And Europe is like 5 to 10 years ahead of us. So it is problematic. If they are toying around with this policy, this could come to our shores in the near future if we're not careful, if we don't elect good representatives who recognize that agriculture is good for the environment. Actually, you don't have cows on the landscape. What regenerative agriculture are you going to have? Cows are actually very positive, net positive for farming and ranching on private lands. I've talked about this at length. I've done video reports in Florida and other states talking about agriculture, Florida in particular, how cows keep Florida and America green. These poor creatures are vilified for simply existing, and the farmers and ranchers tend to their livestock pretty well, and these cows serve a purpose. Not only economically, but environmentally. And if you want to learn exactly what that is, I'm going to link to my How Cows Keep Florida Green report, because the farmers and ranchers we spoke to are so eloquent and knowledgeable about this subject. I don't want to mince their words or misconstrue what they say. I think you need to hear it from the farmers directly, America's farmers and ranchers. So there's something rotten in Denmark, as the Hamlet quote famously says, literally. I loved my visit to the country for the first time last month. I got to reconnect with some friends. I did a lot of walking. I saw fishing charters. I had some delicious food. I saw so many attractions and landmarks. Loved the architecture. It's beautiful. I recommend taking a canal cruise. That's the best way to see Copenhagen if you only have like a day or so. As I did, I had like a day and a half to see the city. But it's such a highly taxed, far left parliament. I don't know how my friends there, some who are elected officials, can live there. They're paying like half of their income in taxes. That's unheard of. And they're also paying these carbon taxes and imposing these burdens onto producers, which makes absolutely no sense. And once you hamstring the producers, they pass down those costs to consumers, and then consumers will then have to forfeit their ability to purchase meat because it becomes so expensive and vilified and perceptively dirty and harmful to the environment. So they price people out of eating meat through these measures, such as a carbon tax or a flatulence tax. I'll keep tabs on this story and offer periodic updates as they come, or if other countries in Europe adopt this, but I'm not a fan of this policy. I think it stems from net zero, which is very problematic. It's anathema to common sense, and this is indicative of why. And let's leave the cows alone. They don't need so much hate. We need to appreciate cows. Everyone loves fluffy cows. The Shetland, Highland mini cows are adorable. And beef cows are delicious. Let's not get that misconstrued whatsoever. Cows are delicious. And you can also think there's nothing wrong with holding those two views. They're not in direct opposition with one another. They're not mutually exclusive. But so disappointing to see this from such a great country like Denmark. I hope they reconsider this really terrible policy. If you enjoyed this installment of District of Conservation, I would love to know your feedback. Send it my way. Please be sure to leave us reviews on Apple, Spotify, or wherever podcasts are played, and also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to never miss a beat nor a guest announcement. Thanks so much for listening to District of Conservation. I hope you have a wonderful day, and please share the podcast to those who may be interested in learning more about these critical natural resources, environment, energy issues.